Never trust technology. Anyway, it's lovely to be here. Thank you very much to Juliana for inviting me. It's my first time in Rostov, not my first time in Russia. I've been to Moscow and St. Petersburg, but never been to this part of Russia before, so really nice to be here. I live in Israel and I work there, teach there. And I have to tell you something about Israeli audiences. Israeli audiences interrupt you all the time. They're very sort of forthright. Actually, I quite like that because then it gives me a sense of dialogue rather than just talking myself. So if you feel like interrupting, if you want to ask something or say something or add something, please raise your hands. Don't wait till the end and we'll get a dialogue going. So today is built of 4 sessions going from slightly more theoretical, but not very theoretical, to very, very practical at the end, getting more practical as we go on. And the first one I'm going to talk about is the research and its relevance to teaching practice. I'm going to start off, my plenaries always turn into workshops for some reason, so I'm going to start off with this. Of the following factors, which do you feel has contributed most to your present teaching expertise? And give each a grade of 1 to 5. So these here. Chat to the person sitting next to you for a minute or two. Introduce yourselves, you don't know their name yet, and say what grade would you give to each of those items. Okay, let's hear what you say. And we're talking now about your own teaching in your own classrooms. Let's add something here. So, what score would you give to your pre-service teacher course? How many people would give it a 5? 4? 3? 2? 1? 0? No, some people are not voting, so let's do it again. If you gave it a 5, raise your hand when I say 5. You thought it was really important. If you think it was not so important, you raise your hand when I say 4. Okay? I want this because I want to be able to put in the numbers myself. I'll do it in a sec. No. Just let me go. Okay. Okay. So your pre-service teacher course. Would you give that a 1, 2, 3 or 5? 5? 4? 3? 2? 1? Okay, I'll give that a 3. You can't see it, but I'll put it up on the screen in a moment. Later courses, seminars or conferences, what would you give that? A 1? Sorry, let's go to from the top. 5. Things like this, okay? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. About a 4 on average, I would say. Feedback from students, what would you give that? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0, about 3. Practical help or advice from colleagues, what would you give that? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, about 3.5, something like that. It was quite high. 3, where's the Is this number 3.5? Your own classroom experience, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, okay. So that's 5. And reading the professional literature, research, books like mine. You don't have to...
5.
No, you don't have to give it a 5. I wouldn't give it a 5. Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Again, about 3-ish, I suppose. Okay, let's see what we've got here. Those are the scores you gave. Look at number 5. It got a 5. It's the only one who got a 5. All the others got less. In other words, teachers, and this is the sort of result that I get when I speak to teachers all over the world. Always, this one gets the top marks and everything else gets less. It varies how much people give to the other points, but always classroom experience is absolutely at the top. And the conclusion is that in general, experience is most important. The interesting thing is that it's not just teaching. First of all, evidence from the field, what the teachers say, like you and me. But it's interesting that it's true also of doctors, nurses, psychologists, architects, psychiatrists. Anyone who works with people in a profession will tell you that it's experience which makes the most difference to their knowledge and their expertise. And it's interesting that if you look at the internet, you very often find this contrast, novice versus expert. If you think about it, it's not actually an opposite. Novice is the opposite of experienced, isn't it? An expert is the opposite of non-expert. But the assumption is that a novice is not an expert and that someone experienced is an expert. In other words, experience is the main component of expertise. And then there's research on expertise, which says the same thing. I don't know if any of you have read a book called The Outliers by Gladwell. I recommend it. It's really, really interesting, about people who are good at all sorts of things, sports, chess, professions. And the same thing, what makes the difference is the number of hours you have invested in actually doing your job. So, okay, experience is most important. And you come on to the next question. How important is the research? Because some of the researchers themselves would have us believe that this is really, really important. You know, you ought to be reading the research and basing your teaching on what you learn from the research. And you'll find vastly conflicting approaches in the literature. People like Alan Maley, who say that academic research has relatively modest value, it's not that important, versus the academics themselves, who say that research and academic knowledge are absolutely central and important. Well, my position is somewhere in the middle, which I'll come on and talk about in a moment. But another interesting piece of evidence is the major ELT journals. You're acquainted with these, or some of them anyway, the first two certainly. ELT Journal and TESOL Quarterly started out as practical ideas for the teacher. The first few issues of TESOL Quarterly and ELT Journal were all sort of practical stuff, rather like English Teaching Professional today, if you know that journal. But what's happened today is that the TESOL Quarterly, you cannot get published in TESOL Quarterly unless it's original empirical research. And ELT Journal, which for a long time maintained its focus on practical aspects, I looked at the last few issues and every single article is based on the author's research. Again, so you're getting this shift towards research. If you want to get published, you have to be respectable, and if to be respectable, you have to do research. So, or at least base your article on research evidence. And RELT Journal, which is the Singapore, very prestigious journal, also very much based on research, and System, also. They're very good journals, incidentally, and I really enjoy reading their stuff, but again, all research. Research is respectable, research is what the teachers should be learning about, but teachers say, and it's very true, that the main source of expertise is actually practical experience. So where does the research come in? My position is this, that academic research is a minor but significant contributor to teacher expertise. It cannot be the main thing. The main thing has to remain experience and reflection on experience. Having said that, there is a place for the research, and what I'm going to do for the rest of this talk is give some examples of where the research can be helpful and how. Problem is how to identify research that can benefit practitioners and how to make it accessible. There's an enormous amount. You just don't have time to look at it, and you will look at the evidence here. Teachers read the research very little. So someone called Simon Bork did some research and asked teachers, how much do you read the research? And the answer was 3.8% said never, 28% said rarely, 51% said sometimes, and 15%, a very small percentage, said often. And why don't they read the research? Well, the main reason is no time. Teachers are simply teaching most of the time and preparing lessons. When do you have time to look at the research? You know, how many hours do you teach a week normally in Russia? 40. I mean, and you've got to prepare and you've got to check students' assignments. When do you have time to look at the research? Another reason is lack of clarity. A lot of the research articles are written not very clearly. A lot of them are not very practical. How does this apply to my teaching? Or maybe it doesn't apply to my teaching. Let's look at each of these in time. On time, first of all, as I said, a full teaching schedule, plus preparation, plus marking, doesn't leave you any time. Reading the research is not part of teachers' job descriptions. It's not written into your employment contract. And sometimes it's even actively discouraged. I gave an earlier version of this talk at IATEFL one year, and at the end of the talk, a teacher came up to me and said, my director of studies in my language school actually told me not to waste my time reading the research, quote unquote. Yeah, I implore you to teach my students not to read the research. She's actually being discouraged. But even if you're not actively discouraged, you don't have the time because it's not written into your job description. Lack of clarity. Sometimes this is inevitable because the writer is using statistics which we don't understand. I don't understand a lot of the complicated statistics in some of the research articles. Sometimes they're using terminology which they have to use because this expresses something they need to say, and there's not any sort of usual terms which will cover it, which is fair enough. But sometimes it's totally gratuitous, it's totally unnecessary. You have these people writing in very, very academic, opaque language just for the sake of it and for the sake of impressing their colleagues and getting published, and ordinary people like me and you can't really understand what they're saying. So there is that problem as well. Difficult language for its own sake. Limited practical application of a lot of the studies, partly because of the aims of the researcher. Researchers are not writing for teachers. Researchers on applied linguistics and language acquisition and so on are not writing for us. They are writing for their colleagues. They're writing for other researchers who are going to read their articles and decide whether to publish them or not. And therefore, they're writing in order to, yes, at the highest level they're writing in order to come up with something really interesting and useful. But very often in order to complete a doctoral thesis or to get published. And these are the main things, but they're not writing them in order to be practical, in order to benefit a practitioner. The second reason why there's limited practical application is that the researchers themselves, because they've spent their time doing research, have not spent much time in the classroom. They don't really know very much about the practical problems of those of us who are working in the classroom, and they simply do not have the necessary expertise to provide practical guidance. Very often in these articles you'll get a section at the end saying practical implications for the classroom. I always tell my students skip that bit when you get to it, because probably the writer doesn't know what they're talking about in 9 cases out of 10. But you, if the research is interesting, you decide how you might use it. It's interesting that TESOL Quarterly, for example, tell their contributors, you must have a section which talks about practical application. And very often the person who's writing the article has no idea about practical application, sort of inventing it as they go along. And it's not terribly useful. So many excellent studies followed by inappropriate, even rubbishy suggestions about how to use in teaching. Probably it's the teachers themselves reading the article who are best qualified to say if and how the research can be applied. Can I pause for a moment and ask if I'm clear? Yeah. Not too fast, not too slow? No. Accent okay? I've been living in Israel for 50 years, and most of my life. And you know, my English is sort of international rather than British English, but the one thing that has not changed is my British accent, which you can hear. Okay, limited practical application 3. The researchers on the whole are talking about language acquisition, aspects of applied linguistics, okay, about pedagogical, purely pedagogical aspects, which include things like teaching large classes. I haven't seen any research on teaching large classes, or teaching mixed classes, which I'm going to be talking about today, mixed ability classes. People don't do research on this. It's very difficult to find. Discipline problems. Do you have discipline problems in Russia? Yeah. Yeah, we have a lot of them in Israel. Teaching for exams, which is a major part of your thing. No research on it. The local culture of learning, the way students expect to be taught and are normally taught in particular cultures. So there's no research on cultures and cultural aspects of learning. I mean, in some parts of the world, they expect the teacher to be all-knowing and tell them everything. In other parts of the world, they expect the teacher to be a facilitator and activate the students. Some parts of the world, great prominence given to learning by heart. Other parts of the world, it's not, and so on. And this is quite important if we know what our students' culture of learning is, how they like being taught, how they learn well. It really helps us to teach well. No research on it. Limited preparation and teaching time is another problem which has not been addressed in the research. Another interesting point about why the research is not relevant to teachers, not useful to teachers, is that local pressures may ensure that even if a research issue has come up with clear and sensible, I mean applicable, clearly very likely to be true results, they may not be used in practice because of local stakeholder pressure or the policies of whoever decides what shall happen, what shall not happen in state schools, for example, ministries of education. This is a classic example, the age of starting English in schools. If you're talking about instructed English, that's to say a situation where the children are speaking another language outside the classroom and only speaking English for 2, 3, 4 lessons a week in school, which is true of a lot of places. It's true of here, for example, or in my situation. In that sort of situation, the research shows that it is not a good idea to start early. It doesn't help them very much. Much better to get literacy in their mother tongue and to start learning English at early adolescence. That's the most effective time to start. Whereas in an immersion situation where they're speaking English, hearing English the whole time, they go to live in New York, for example, it's good to start as early as possible. So there's a big difference in research between when it is good to start. In an instructed situation, as in Russia or Israel or France or Germany, it's probably better to start later. And there's very solid research to back this up. But it's not implemented in practice because most people, the naive public, believe that earlier is better, never mind when, you know, it's instructed or not instructed. You ought to start from kindergarten, you ought to start prenatal, you ought to start, you know, really start early, the earlier the better, which is not true in our situation. But because most people believe it is true, and because most people, adults, have the vote, so a Ministry of Education is going to put into practice policies which will get them votes, not policies which are necessarily supported by the research. And that's why all over Europe, for example, you'll find that people are bringing in, ministries of education are bringing in early starts to English, even if it's not very effective, in order to be popular. So that's one reason why the research is not implemented. The pressure of parents, politicians, and commercial interests outweighs the evidence. Okay, let's come on to the main part of my talk, which is about the contribution of research to teacher knowledge. But I'll pause for a second. Does anyone would like to make a comment or ask a question about what I've said so far? Yes.
Maybe about early start.
Yeah.
What is the best age to start? Because we all are concerned about that.
The evidence is something like 11 or 12 years old. But in Israel, for example, we start sort of, I think, 9, 10, which is a reasonable compromise between what people want and what is effective. So sort of between 9 and 12, that sort of area. But starting English at the age of 3, when you're speaking Russian the rest of the time, is not really very helpful. Unless you have a total immersion situation where you're speaking English at home, where the parents are English speakers, which is different, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, this is always a controversial topic, yeah. Anybody else?
I know it's really controversial, but do you personally believe in critical age? Because that's what, I mean, for learning, that's what they say about, like, it's either this age of about 12 or 6, depending on who you read. And for what I read about this early start, they said that if you start earlier, let's say at the age of 6, then by the age of 14 and 15, those who started at around 10 or 11, they would catch up with you in terms of, I don't know, grammar and other aspects of the language. However, their phonological structure would still be lagging behind, and probably their listening comprehension as well. So they say, I mean, that's what I read, that's probably in terms of listening and in terms of you know, phonetics and what sounds you produce, then the earlier the better, if you believe in critical age, of course. It's still a hypothesis, not.
Yes, the critical age hypothesis is controversial, but it as you say, there's been a lot of research. I recommend you read the reference I've given here, Munoz and Singleton, on this, which is fairly up to date and very balanced and quotes all the other research. The evidence is that, for example, in the Canadian studies, where they have these immersion schools, where English-speaking children are put in French-speaking schools, where all the subjects are taught in French, and they looked at looking at the critical age hypothesis. They looked at children who'd started at kindergarten and had French immersion all the way up, and children who only started at age 12 and studied until 12th grade. But they looked at the total number of hours they had had, and they looked at groups which had the same total number. So the ones who started earlier had say 3,000 hours, but spread out over 12 years. And the ones who started later had 3,000 hours spread out over 5 years. And the second group outperformed the first. In other words, the ones who'd had the hours concentrated from grades 7 to 12 did a lot better, even in pronunciation. And the general conclusion is that people who start later actually learn faster. They learn differently. The ones who start earlier learn in a much more natural way of sort of soaking up the language in the way a child soaks up its first language. And they learn very effectively, but not efficiently. In other words, they learn very well, but much more slowly. If you could create a situation where the children had that sort of a lot of exposure, say, 4 or 5 hours a day all the way up the school, they would do much better if they started earlier. But you very rarely get that. So it depends on the number of hours and how the hours are distributed on the whole. But it depends who you read. Again, it's very controversial. It's not certainly there's no clear evidence one way or the other. Okay. So, any further questions about that? Move on. In principle, why I think that research, I said before, it's significant, a minor but significant contributor to expertise. Why? Because it provides us with information and knowledge that we could not otherwise achieve. In other words, there's just so far you can get with your own experience. It enables us to progress beyond a ceiling. You can just get so far based on experience, discussion with colleagues, your own students, and so on and so on. Beyond that, you have to look outside, and the best way to look for that is to read the research. 3 kinds of research you come across in the literature. Primary empirical research, where someone's done an experiment. Very often it's with experiential and control groups. So one group gets a certain kind of treatment which another group doesn't have, and the researcher looks to see if the first group outperforms the second group. That's empirical research. Secondary research is where people look at other people's research and draw conclusions. Very often a survey or what's called a meta-analysis, taking all sorts of studies and saying, well, from the evidence, this is what we think to be true. And the third one is position papers, where someone has taken up a position, say, that communicative language teaching is good, and they want to prove it, and they look at the research to see what can help them prove their point. Of these, for teachers, what are most helpful are firstly the primary empirical research looking at actual experiments, and the surveys or meta-analyses. I rather distrust the third one, because someone who's setting out to prove a certain point of view is liable to go for what's called cherry picking. Cherry picking is picking out the particular research which support what they're saying and conveniently ignoring the rest. So I'm a bit skeptical about the third type, but and most of my evidence that I'm going to bring in this talk are from the first 2 kinds of research. So the research can help us in 4 main ways. Firstly, to confirm previous assumptions. I thought that this is important. Oh, good, the research confirms it. That's great. It makes you feel nice and comfortable. Not always. Secondly, yes, I thought this, but oh, the research is adding to what I knew and making it more refined, more careful, more accurate. So that's another useful one. Third one, provides something new I hadn't thought of, I hadn't known about, and the only way I could find out about it is through the research. So it's information. And fourthly, destabilize it. I always thought this was true. Whoops, here's some research that says the opposite. Who's right? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I've been doing the wrong thing. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that from my own experience. Okay, let's go through these one by one and see where we go. What time do I have to finish? In another hour? Yes? Sorry? Okay, so I have another hour. Okay, I'm probably take a little bit less than that, but that's okay. So, firstly, confirming previous assumptions. The importance of explicit grammar teaching, teaching grammar rules. Well, you'll be happy to hear that. Yes, it's a good idea. A very influential, much quoted study by Norris and Ortega, published in 2001, already quite a while ago, but it's quoted all over the place, which took an enormous number of studies on teaching rules, correcting, giving practice, all these sort of explicit grammar teaching strategies, and they found that yes, it makes a significant difference to students' learning. Students actually do perform better in grammar if they have this kind of input. They found no significant, if any of you know about the difference between form focus over forms focus, forms focus is the traditional, having a grammatical syllabus. Today we're going to learn about comparative adjectives, and here's the rules and here's some exercises. Form focus is when, within a communicative, task-based framework, you don't teach the grammar proactively, but if you come up against it in a communicative task, you take time out to talk about it, focus on it, and correct mistakes and so on. So that's form focus. It's a way of teaching grammar within a communicative methodology. So they found no particular difference between the two ways of teaching grammar, form focus or forms focus, but they did find that in general it was really important to give rules, to give practice, to give explicit correction and so on. Example 2, the importance for mastery of repeated exposure to new vocabulary. We all know that if you teach a word once, it probably won't be remembered. You need to review it. Okay? And the research confirms this very strongly. You need to encounter new items several times in order to remember it, and how you encounter it is also important. I'll come on to that in a moment. How many? Probably between 6 and 16 times, according to the research. It's not even enough to do it twice, although it'll vary according to how good the student is, how difficult the item is, and so on, what quality of exposure you're having. But this is the sort of number of times you need to have review of a new item. My second category was adding more depth and detail to previous knowledge. So I already said, yes, review is important, but what the research has added for me is this thing about the quality of the repeated exposures, not just the quantity. So what's important, I'll show you these different studies in a moment because it's really interesting. The importance of not just showing the student the word again, or putting it on the board and letting them read it, or letting them come across it in a text, but actually getting them to retrieve it from memory. So giving them the meaning and ask them to tell you what the form is. Give the word in Russian, what's the English for it? Or give the word in English and ask them to make a sentence with it, or connect it with other words. Do something with it, not just see it or hear it. And various interesting studies here. The quality of the encounters is important. So, as I just said, passive exposure, repetition is not very helpful. And learners need to be actively retrieving from memory either the form or the meaning of the item. So this was the first one I read. And interesting, it's from not from a language learning journal at all. It's from a periodical, I think, called Science Direct, about scientific research in general. And I just happened to come across it through someone's recommendation, don't even remember how. And their study was this. They gave students 40 words to learn in Swahili. And then they divided them into two, and they gave them different kinds of review. One group was simply asked to study the lists again. In other words, the 40 words in Swahili and the 40 words, these were English students, translated into English, and they just had to study the list again. And the other group was given a test, was given the words in English and asked to produce the Swahili words, or the other way around, I don't know what it was. And as soon as they remembered all of them, the ones that they remembered, they were not tested on again. And for some of them, a different group, it was quite a complicated piece of research, as some of them, even if they got it right, they asked them to be tested about it again. But the main point is of these, the study was whether the students who were mainly studying the lists again, or the students who were being tested learned better, and the students who were being tested learned better, almost across the board, very clearly. So what he called test, what I would call active retrieval, or trying to remember the word yourself rather than being told it, it showed that the retrieval was better. A different one was done with using Hebrew words. Students were shown a word and then the picture, and they had to learn the Hebrew word according to the picture. And then how did they do the practice? Group one, they just showed them the word and the picture again and asked them to read, rather like the previous study showing the bilingual lists again, but in this case the word and the picture showing them again. The group, interestingly, they did the same thing, but they showed the picture and then there was a 3-second pause before they showed the word. So during that 3-second, they tried to remember on their own what the word was. So they had this retrieval bit, and then they saw the word which confirmed their guesses, or didn't, as the case may be. And again, where they had to work a little bit at retrieving the word, they learned better. The final one, which is fairly recent, a colleague of mine, Batya Laufer from Haifa University, and a doctoral student of hers, they did a study where they asked students, first of all, to learn words through encountering them in a text. So learning them in context and being told what the words meant if they couldn't guess them. And they then they were divided into two groups. One group read the words within different contexts. So they were reviewing them again by reading them in different contexts. And the other group did sort of gap fill exercises and matching exercises with the same words. So they actually had a sort of kind of test situation. And they played fair in the sense that they gave the students the same amount of time. The group who were just encountering the words through reading in new text took the same time as the ones who were doing vocabulary exercises. But even so, group 2 learned better. The ones who were actually having to do the exercises learned better than the ones who were just exposed to the words in context. So bottom line, all of these are saying the same thing. That you learn new words better, or new expressions, new lexical items better, if you actually have to work a little bit to retrieve them rather than just seeing them again. Example 2 is also quite interesting and quite an old study, but again it's much quoted. Oral feedback. They looked at 6 different types of correction. Recast is when your student makes a mistake when in oral interaction, and you simply say the correct form back at them. So let's say I say to a student, "What are you doing?" And the student says, "I sitting," and I say, "I am sitting." Okay, I just recast. Elicitation is when the student says, "I sitting," and I say, "I," and I try to get the student to correct themselves. The third is clarification of meaning. So the student says, "I sitting," I say, "What are you doing? Can you tell me again what you're doing?" Focusing on meaning here. The fourth is metalinguistic feedback. That means the student says I sitting, I say you're using the present continuous, and in the present continuous you should have the verb to be. Okay? Do you say present continuous or present progressive here in?
Continuous.
Both, okay, in continuous. Explicit correction is when you actually say to the student, no, you made a mistake. And the student either self-corrects or you correct them, but you're actually making it clear that they were wrong. And finally, correction is when I actually repeat the mistaken thing, I sitting, but with a rising intonation and a sort of expression on my face which implies that they're actually doing it wrong. And again, it's rather like elicitation in that you get the student to self-correct. Which do you think is the most common?
Recast. This is the worst one.
Recast is the most common. Here are the statistics according to Lister's. Incidentally, I forgot to say at the beginning of this talk that at the end of the talk and the end of each of my talks, I will give you my email, which is very easy. Actually, you could make it up as you go along. It's pennyur@gmail.com. And if you want a copy of any of these slides or presentations, please email me and I'll send them to you. Okay, so you don't have to take photos of screen. I mean, you can if you like, but you don't have to. So this is frequency of use. Which is the most effective in terms of uptake? Now, uptake does not mean they remember it forever and ever, because a correction won't do that. But uptake means there is evidence that they understood and took on board the correction at that moment, so it was contributing to their learning. What do you think are the most effective from the point of view of uptake? I'll show you, see if you're right. What is the least effective? The easiest, the quickest, the most common, the least effective. One reason may be that the students may not even sometimes see it as a correction. Rod Ellis has this little anecdote which I always retell because it really makes clear this phenomenon. It talks about a teacher who was teaching a class of adult students in a language school in the south of England, and they were learning the past tense, irregular past tense. And he wanted to activate them by practicing this in context. And he asked one of the students, what did you do last night? And the student said, I go to the pub. And the teacher said, you went to the pub? And the student said, yes, I go to the pub. Now, what was happening there was that the student was hearing what the teacher said as an echo or as a confirmation and not as a correction, didn't take it on board. And what Lister says in his research is that very often this may happen more often than we think. And the students just don't hear the correction, or even if they hear it, it doesn't sort of enter their minds very much. Whereas all the others, where there has to be some kind of negotiation, they actually have to say the right form or understand what went wrong, they're more likely to have some kind of uptake. So these are the results, and they've been confirmed by later research as well. I'll come on to some implications of these later. My third category was provide new information. And the main example of this is corpus studies, which over the last 30, 40 years have been really important and progressed a lot. Does everyone know what corpus studies are? The study of an enormous, yes? Would you like to say?
I'm on my PhD. I'm writing a thesis on methodology, and I'm trying to prove that we are supposed to use corpus linguistics to sort the materials, the vocabulary, and so on and so forth. So I do deal with the linguistic corpus.
Yeah, great. Yes, people are using corpora more and more these days. A corpus is an enormous database of natural English, spoken and written. And the most important thing that it does for us, perhaps, is tell us how common different words are, or different phrases are, even. I use the corpora which has been set up and put on the web by Brigham Young University, Mark Davis and his colleagues. If any of you know COCA, the American Contemporary English Corpus, or BNC, the British National Corpus. And it's really interesting to look, as you say, find out things relevant to English teaching. And one offshoot of the corpus studies has been the various kinds of text inspectors. I've got a few examples here. One is word and phrase, which is based on the BYU corpora, which I just mentioned. Also there is the English profile based on the Cambridge corpus. So we'll look at the profiling tools now, the text inspector. What these do for you is you can put in any text you like, and the program will tell you how common the various words are in the text, so you know which words or which phrases are probably most worth teaching your students. So, for example, we've got the English profile, which is the Cambridge one, word and phrase, which is the BYU one, Lex Tutor, which is Bachelaufer and Webb and various researchers on vocabulary set up a whole website called Lex Tutor, which is worth looking at for all sorts of other reasons. But the one which I'm going to show you here is one called Word and Phrase, which is based on, this particular one is based on COCA, on the American very, very large corpus of contemporary English. And why this is useful is that they give you this tool where you can feed in a text in the window you have here, and it will tell you how common the different items in it are. So, for example, here's a text from an Israeli textbook, and I was interested for an intermediate class, sort of A to B1 students, and I was interested to know which of the phrases, which of the words here is most important to teach, which are the ones they should know already, and which ones are perhaps a bit more advanced. So I take this text here. Okay, you finished reading it? Don't need to finish reading it, I mean you get the main idea. And I typed it into this, I mean I could do it online here, but I did it in advance to make because I don't trust the technology. So here I've put in the text and thing, and I click on search, and it shows me this. It gives me the words color-coded. I'll put them in a bigger screen so you can see them better now. Color-coded according to frequency. Okay? So the blue words are the very, very easy words which they should know, sort of grammatical words and very simple words. The green words are sort of what they should know at intermediate level, and if they don't know, I should teach them. And the yellow words are relatively rare, but I might or might not want to teach them as well. But it gives me an idea of what the different levels of the different items are, so it's a really useful tool to have. And of all the three which I showed you now, the Lex Tutor and the lexical profile and the word and phrase, which is this one, I think this one is the most useful for teachers. The lexical profile one of Cambridge University Press is useful if you're using the CFR, the A1, A2, B1, B2 levels, because it defines the words not by 1,000, but by A1, B2, and so on. So if you're using that, it's probably more useful for you. Okay, and this is my fourth category, sorry, of why the research is useful for us. And it's the most fun and the most surprising, and it's research which I've found which has made me think again about my own assumptions about what's good teaching. So let's look at a couple of examples here. Guessing from context. Now, guessing from context is something which we have been advised is a good thing to do, right? If your students come across a word in a context which they don't know, I should not just tell them what it means, I should ask them to guess. Now, one of Batya's first research studies which he did, but it's a classic, and I read it again recently and thought, wow, this is amazing. Benselson and Laffer took a text and they identified 70 words which the students at the level they were teaching are unlikely to know. And they looked at the words and they asked themselves, if I didn't know this word, could I guess it from context? And what they found was this. Out of them, almost 30 words, there was no contextual clue whatever. In other words, there was no way you could guess what it meant. For 28, they found, yes, partial clues. They might be able to guess more or less what the word means. And clear clues, yes, they would be able to guess this one for 13. But these were professors, okay, and they were looking at what I would be able to guess myself. They gave this to students, and what they found was that students were able to guess correctly only 17 out of the 70 words. A different research done by Nasaji from Canada. He gave students a text out of which he knew they knew at least 95% of the surrounding words. Now, according to the research, if you know 95 to 98% of the words in a text, you should be able to understand the gist of the text, and you should be able to guess the remaining words. So he played fair with them. He gave them a text which they understood. But the 5% included words he knew they didn't know and which they had to guess. And what he was primarily interested in was how they set about guessing. I looked at how the word is composed of morphemes. I looked at the surrounding words. I looked at what had come before. And so he made them guess the words. But as they were guessing the words, they were speaking into a microphone and verbalizing what they were thinking and how they were guessing. He was interested in the strategies they were using. But what he found was, so think aloud protocols or procedures, but what he found was in more than half the cases, they guessed wrong. Third study. And these people did the same sort of thing. They also found that in more than 50% of the cases they guessed wrong, but a very interesting additional thing which Bachelard has also found and other researchers also found, I've found as well, is that students consistently overestimated what they understood. They said, yes, I understand this word, it means They were quite sure they understood, and they didn't. And they'd guessed wrong. And the fact that they'd guessed wrong means that after continuing to read the text, they continued to have mistaken assumptions and found it more difficult to understand the text as a whole as a result. It's a really interesting result. There were no differences in they looked at gender, but there was no difference between men and women, how well they guessed it. But students tend to overestimate what they understand. Let's try it out. Okay, give me a break for a moment, do some work yourselves, talk to the people you would see next to. See, there are 7 words here. See if there are any of them you can make a pretty good guess what the missing word is. And see, and write, can you write it down? Because I'm going to show you the answers in a moment and you can check yourselves. In general, this is about autonomy in motivation. Okay, the word autonomy comes up several times. And motivation. Okay, I'll show you the results and then you make any comments about how many you got right. So.
These are content words, that's why.
What?
Because these are content words. If you have taken away function words, so would it...
No, but it's when the students are guessing, they're guessing content words.
Yeah,
When you ask a student to guess, you don't ask them to guess a grammatical word.
Sure.
You always want them to guess a new word you want to teach. So it's always content. Autonomous motivation down here, so theoretically they should have been able to guess that this was autonomous, but you didn't, right? And you are intelligent, good speakers of English and everything, so you know it's not really reasonable to expect our students to be able to guess them. How many did you get right?
0.
How many people got 1 right?
1.
Well done. Which one did you get right? The last one? Engagement? Yeah. How many got 2 right? 3, 4. Wow, wonderful. Well done. But this is all content words, and it is an area you are familiar with. It's education, motivation, and so on, and so on, and so on. But it's almost impossible to guess most of the words. And this is not because of lack of guessing strategies. In other words, training our students to guess is not going to help them very much. It's not because you didn't know the meanings of the surrounding words. It is simply because in a natural text, in most cases, words are not guessable. They're simply not guessable. And therefore, if we ask our students to guess them, we're setting them up for failure. So why should we do it? Question. Just an allied question is another piece of research which is also very interesting. Does guessing from context, if successful, lead to better learning? In other words, the words which you did manage to guess, or if a student does manage to guess right, will he therefore, she therefore remember that word better? And there's been some research on this as well, really interesting research by a Dutch researcher called Mondrian, who was looking at Dutch students learning English. And he asked, is there a relationship between inferencing and ultimate learning? If you inference, if you guess the word from context and do so successfully, you're going to remember it better. And he had Dutch students learning French, not learning English, learning French, and gave them 70 target words, not known, not cognates, not guessable from morphemes, and only guessable from the context. But he played fair with them. In this case, he gave them what's called pregnant sentences. Sentences, nothing to do with having babies. A pregnant sentence is a sentence where the meaning is completely clear from context, otherwise they could guess it. So it took out this thing about not being able to guess. He gave them words which they could guess from context, and what he wanted to know was if he gave one group to guess the context and the other group just gave them the meanings, would the group who had to guess and guessed right, would they actually learn the words better? That was his question. So it took he gave them the two was called meaning given and meaning inferred. Meaning given, he just gave them the translations into Dutch. Meaning inferred, they guessed from context and guessed right, but they were also given the glossary afterwards so they could check they were right. And they were trained to inference and so on. And then they were tested, the two groups were tested. So the meaning inferred, they worked out the meanings, checked using the glossary, and then had time to study. Group 2, meaning given, they were just given the meanings and given time to memorize. And then they were both tested. And the results, there was no significant difference between the results. But, the students who also had to infer took a lot more time. So your question is it worth my investing that extra time if I'm not getting any extra learning out of it? Probably not. Probably not. In any way, it's something which you have to think about. So this sort of assumption, why did I say this is destabilizing? Because I assumed that it was a good thing to get my students to guess from context. And now after all this research, I'm thinking, maybe actually it's a bit of a waste of time. Maybe I should ask them to guess from context only when I'm sure they can, not set them up for failure or frustration. And on the whole, if there's an unknown word in a text, on the whole, I'll just tell them what it means. Meaning given process was more efficient, and it was found that another interesting thing from the Mondrian, the Dutch study, was that the most significant difference was the amount of time they had to memorize the words. And again, they, just to repeat what I said before, they overestimated. General conclusions then. If your aim is vocabulary learning, then probably guessing meaning from context is in most cases not worth doing. Students will usually guess wrong, they'll get demotivated, they'll get the wrong idea, and they may even remember the wrong answer. Better just to tell the answer and use the time saved to engage with the new words in context, do things with them to teach them. Okay, any comments about this before I go on to the next?
It sounds counterintuitive. Really.
All of these, I mean, all the one I'm talking about under the heading of destabilizing, all these are counterintuitive. That's why I'm presenting them, because they're instances where I thought one thing, and the research said, wait a moment.
Because this other research always says that, I mean, when you actually make the steps to come to the right conclusion, like the difference between, like, basically inferring meaning. So probably the...
Sorry, can you say that again so everyone can hear?
Yeah, yes. So I'm saying that when you teach something like, explicitly and implicitly, so when like infer the meaning, even if it's a grammatical meaning, for example, again, like some research says that probably you will retain the material better. So if you just explain the rules, grammatical rules, teaching from the front rather than students guessing the rules themselves, I think it works the same for a vocabulary, like lexical meaning, doesn't it? So it's like sounds. I mean, that's what we usually learn in CELTER courses and other ones. That this is how it should be done, and then you learn this. That it's probably not always like this. Yeah.
Am I undermining your CELTER courses?
No.
I think the main point of what you're saying, and I'll come back to this because when I'm talking about higher order thinking skills, is that if you are learning a new bit of grammar or a new word or a new expression, and you do something with it using higher order thinking skills, what's called deep processing, you are likely to remember it better, which is true. But guessing from context is not deep thinking, it's not deep processing, it's not going to help you. I don't agree that guessing from something from context when you're guessing wrong is a useful thing to do. It's a useful thing to do if you guess right. And processing using higher order thinking skills is also a useful thing. Same thing with grammar, inferencing a grammar rule by seeing all sorts of examples and what's called induction, working out the rule from the examples, is good, and it will help you remember, provided you guess right. But if you get the wrong answer, then you're not only misleading yourself and misleading other students and getting demoralized, you're also not learning so well. So it's dodgy.
And what about this? Just one last question, sorry for taking this long. What about all these, like activating your schemata when we give the gist questions before reading text or listening to them? When we want our students to start discussing something for a couple of minutes, is it worth doing that at least?
At least. Yeah, you're making me feel really bad about this. I think anything which gets them to think and to process the language input through thinking and I'll talk about this a lot in the next session, is good, provided it doesn't lead to the wrong conclusions, demoralization, and mistakes which will ultimately hold up their learning rather than promoting it. So as long as you're promoting learning, I think thinking is really important, and doing things like this. So yes, as I said before, ask them to guess from context if you're sure they can, if there is enough evidence in the context to help them. And it's a useful reading strategy, because you're not always there to tell them what the answer is. And they don't always have a dictionary. The only thing they've got is being able to guess from context, so they need to know how to guess from context as best they can when they're on their own. But the research stands, I think. We can discuss it later. Anyway, I mean, all this is obviously, as you say, counterintuitive. I'm going to show you another one which is counterintuitive, and I'm going to get into trouble again. Let's see where we go. Teaching words in lexical sets. Andre, are you looking at this? The idea is that, particularly in elementary textbooks, very often new sets of new words are taught in what's called lexical sets. All the colours together, parts of the body, prepositions, things like that, all taught together. Does it help learners learn a new set of words if they're all part of a lexical set? Or semantic set. Sometimes they're called lexical sets, sometimes semantic sets. So these are sort of vertical sets, if you like, all same part of speech. So nose, eyes, mouth, head, hands, all nouns, or red, yellow, green, all colours. And the original research done by Tinkham, he took pseudo words, words which don't actually exist, the words underlined there, and he told the students, these in this fictional language, these mean, the first three mean shirt, jacket and sweater, all part of one lexical set, and these words mean rain, car, frog, nothing to do with each other. And another group, he gave the same pseudo words, but he gave them different meanings, so that there was no way they could be learning the words better because they happened to be easier to learn. So he said, the other group said that these words here actually are the unconnected ones, and these are the connected ones. And he asked them to learn them, and then he tested them. And he wanted to know whether they learned the ones that were all clothes better, or the ones that were disconnected better. And these were his results. They consistently learned the unrelated items better. The interesting thing about this is that he was talking speakers of English learning a fictional language. The research was later replicated several times, and every time they came to the same conclusion. So you've got Waring was dealing with Japanese students. Erten and Tekin, Turkish. Papathanasia, Greek. Wilcox and Medina, I don't remember, but another language. Anyway, all different kinds of, but they all did the same sort of thing. They asked students to learn new words which were all part of the same lexical set, and new words which are completely unconnected, or maybe connected thematically, but not actually the same list. And they tended to learn the lexical sets, the semantic sets, less well. When they were learning words that were linked syntagmatically, not paradigmatically. Okay, paradigmatically is in a list, syntagmatically is they go together in a sentence. So, for example, blue is learned with sky, because they would go together in a natural sentence, better than blue is learned with red. You see what I'm saying here?
Yeah.
General conclusion is that in elementary school textbooks, the authors should really group target vocabulary by situation and theme, not by groups of the same sort of word. We tend to teach words in lexical sets simply because it's very easy to remember and to group them together. If you teach students a whole lot of new words, it's very easy to remember all the colours or remember all the numbers. Or, I mean, if you come across the situation, let's take numbers. you come across a situation where elementary learners, if you ask them what is 8 in English, they go, right? They have to count through because they're learning them one after the other, and they don't remember that 8 is actually 8.
Yeah.
And therefore you have to learn them. You have to do quite a lot of practice to teach them separately. But in general, so if you're teaching new words to an elementary class, better to teach by theme rather than theme or situation rather than lists of the same sort of words. And teachers, if you are landed with a textbook which does this anyway, so you've not got much choice, try to present and practice each item on its own, not just as part of the list. So a red sweater or a red stop sign or something, rather than red, yellow, green. Further notes on this before I ask you for comments. The teaching of lexical sets also tends to result in teaching students unusual and not very helpful items. For example, toes and knee. When did you last talk about your toes? Now, why should we teach students toes? Or the colour purple? Anybody wearing purple here? It's a fairly unusual colour and not used very much, as opposed to red, white, black, which are very common.
It's a famous film.
What?
There's a famous film called Purple.
How many of your students have seen it? Yeah, there is. I mean, it exists as a word, and we use it, but it's relatively rare and probably not worth teaching at elementary level. Another point is, which I need to focus on here, is that this relates to the learning of items for the first time, when you introduce a new set for the first time, not later practice. So if you've, say, learned the colours, you learned red in one lesson and yellow in another context and red in another context, but by the time they finished their first year, they know a whole lot of colours, it's quite useful to use that set as a basis for practice. All I'm saying is, or all the research is saying, is that it's not good to teach all of them together for the first time as a semantic set. The same principle probably applies to any words that can be confused. So if you teach accept and accept together, that's probably not a good idea. Or words that are synonyms or...
Skirt or shirt.
Sorry? Skirt and shirt, yes. They might get... I mean, etymologically, those are the same word, incidentally, they come from the same root, but they mean two different things today in English. So, yes, that's... so this is all I have to say on this particular one. I'll come on to another one in a moment. Any comment about that one? Andre, you want to protest about this one as well? No? Anybody else? My third example of destabilizing is the use of digital technology. Again, something which we are encouraged to do. I don't know how true it is in Russia, but in Israel it's awful. I mean, we even had a directive from the ministry which said every teacher has to use digital technology at least once a week in English lessons. I mean, what's good about digital technology? It's good if it helps them learn, but to use it for its own sake seems to be rather silly. Two pieces of research I want to mention here. One is an overview by Maccaro et al. Published in the Cambridge publication Language Teaching, and the other is an OECD document looking at countries which use technology in their teaching. The Maccaro came to this conclusion, looking at a large number of research on the use of technology for language learning. This exhaustive search of the literature on technology has not yet yielded clear or sufficient evidence of its effectiveness. There is no consistent correlation between the use of technology and good learning. It can be, it's a tool, it helps, like, what about using pencils? Is using pencils a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it's good if it helps, and it's not good if it doesn't. The same goes for technology. It can help, but it is not in itself necessarily something which raises achievement. The OECD, this really made me, wow. I actually went and bought their booklet to check it out, but it's also available on the internet. And what it did was this: it took a whole lot of OECD countries and looked at PISA. Do you know what PISA is? The international tests on reading and so on. And it compared their scores of the country with how much they used technology in the classrooms. And they found this: a generally negative correlation. In other words, the countries which used an enormous amount of technology were also the countries who tended to score low. And I looked at it, I bought the thing and looked at the tables, and it's true. This is what they're saying. Their impact on student performance is mixed at best. Students who use computers moderately at school tend to do well. But, look at this emboldened, students who use computers very frequently at school do a lot worse. What this is saying is there's such a thing as using the technology too much. That actually, if you overuse it, it actually impacts negatively on your learning. We're not just talking about language learning here, but in general. So I revert to what I said before. The use of digital technology is a tool. If it works, use it. If it doesn't work, don't use it. But it is not in itself a value. It is not in itself any guarantee that you will improve learning. So to summarize then, applied linguistic research is an important additional resource, a source of professional knowledge, often inaccessible to teachers for a variety of reasons. We said main thing being time, but also the sheer amount of research available, and how do you choose what to read and what not to read. And it's coming out all the time. And almost every week I get a letter on my email saying, we have just started this new language learning journal, would you like to contribute? There's these new ones coming up all the time because there's an enormous amount of research out there going up. And its value is, the enhancement of teacher understanding by these four examples, these four components which I gave examples during this talk, of which I say the most interesting, but not necessarily the most valuable. The most interesting is the last, debunking popular assumptions. And I'd like just to add a couple of notes about the research. Where there is no supporting research, I think we need to look out for situations where we assume that everything is, that some kind of popular assumption is right because it's popular, but actually there's no research to support it, and we need to be a little bit cautious. If a popular research method or model has no clear research evidence to support it, then we should be cautious. Here's an example. You come across this one? No research at all to show that either that it exists or that if you teach a visual student visually, they'll do any better. And there's quite a lot of writing on this today that we ought to discard this. Neuro-linguistic program, you heard of this? Nothing to show that it works or that it even exists. Multiple intelligences. Interestingly, this is a very popular one. I went to a talk once by Gardner, the originator of this, and he said, quite frankly, no, there is no scientific experiential basis for it, but it is a useful way of thinking about things. I mean, for me, multiple intelligences has been something which has enhanced my thinking, I think. Just let's think about different ways students are intelligent, different ways they learn, even if there is no scientific underlying experiential research which shows that these different particular categories exist. Nevertheless, the fact that students are clever and good at doing different things has been a really useful thing to think about. Task-based instruction, very popular. No research to show it's any better than any other kind. I'm going to spend a minute or two talking about this because I gave this talk in London a few months ago, and I got into terrible trouble because a lot of the teachers there are very, very keen on task-based learning. So, who is Penny Ur? She's getting up and saying task-based learning. And so I'd just like to enlarge on this a little bit. There is no consistent research to show it's better. There is anecdotal research to show that in this situation it worked well. But there is also anecdotal evidence that it worked not so well in other contexts. It's not widely accepted worldwide. Most teachers and textbooks are still based on fairly traditional methods. Very rare, vanishingly rare as the basis for textbooks. And fairly clearly less effective in Asian contexts, such as China, Hong Kong, Vietnam. So can we decide if task-based instruction is better than traditional methods? We can't. We can't really decide that it's better or that it isn't. There's no research saying that it's a failure. Okay, it really depends on your own predilections, and no one method over another. And it can't, because there's just too many variables. There's no way you can say that overall this method is better than that. It's a combination of what I believe, plus my own experience, what has worked for me, plus the local context. What has worked for me in Israel may not work for you in Russia, and vice versa. Plus the local context, plus the local context, two aspects: the age and level of the learners. A methodology that works well for advanced academic learners may not work so well for young or less proficient learners. My own position there, you start with your main topic and then fit it into sentence data. For example, my uncle, he's a great teacher, instead of my uncle is a great teacher. Or he's a great teacher, my uncle. That's a tail. Okay, so you're shifting. This is all aspects of spoken grammar. And why I'm saying it's not very helpful is that arguably these features are true of any language. Heads and tails, think about Russian. Heads and tails, ellipsis, fragments rather than sentences. And the question is, if it's going to be true anyway of any language, do we need to teach it? So it's interesting to be aware of, but a limited application in the classroom. Example 2, the teachability hypothesis. I don't know if you know about this one. The idea that we acquire grammatical structures in a set natural developmental order that is impervious to teaching. In other words, if you teach a grammatical structure that the student is not ready for, they haven't reached in their natural order, they won't be able to learn it, even if you teach it brilliantly, because you have to acquire them in a natural order. Okay? So what Penniman says, there's no point teaching a new grammatical feature when students aren't ready, they haven't got to that stage. We should teach it when they are ready, but in practice, can you do that? It means I have to diagnose where each student is in order to know whether they're ready for my next grammatical structure. And I have a class of 20. I've got to do 20 checks. And even if I do, they're all going to be at different stages. So what do I teach? So what do we teach when? My answer is we can't possibly do it, apply it the way things. And what I'm saying is we carry on teaching the grammatical structures when it seems to us appropriate. What Penniman's work has done for me, which has been interesting, it's made me aware that if a student doesn't get it, it may not be my fault. And it may not be because the student is stupid. It may just be because they're not ready yet. So it's a useful way of thinking. And what it means is that I will need to reteach it later, which I do anyway, but it's nice to have the confirmation. And that's it. Okay, and here's my email if you want me to send you the presentation. Thank you.